What would you do if the people who once knew your dreams best were the very ones who laughed when life forced you to arrive with less than you used to have? That afternoon, the humiliation was small enough for the world to dismiss and sharp enough to stay in a man's chest for years. There was no public scandal, no dramatic betrayal, no blood on the road. Only an old office building, a worn motorcycle, two familiar faces from childhood, and a few mocking sentences spoken with the easy cruelty of people who mistake appearances for truth. Yet, for CEO Jack, those words landed harder than any failed contract, because they did not only insult the vehicle he rode or the wrinkles in his shirt, they touched the deeper fear he had been carrying in silence, that perhaps all his effort, all his endurance, all his attempts to keep moving forward had still left him looking like a failure in the eyes of the world. And so this story does not unfold around a grand catastrophe. It unfolds around something quieter and, in its own way, more devastating, the moment a tired man begins to doubt his own worth, and the woman who loves him chooses not to fix his life, but to sit beside his wounded pride until he can breathe again. The afternoon light had already started to tilt when Jack arrived at the old office building. It was the kind of light that made even ordinary things look touched by memory. Long shadows stretched across the faded exterior walls. Dust hovered briefly in the air before dissolving into the breeze. Jack pulled his worn motorcycle to a stop near the entrance and switched off the engine, the silence that followed feeling almost too sudden. His dress shirt, once neatly pressed in the morning, had grown slightly wrinkled from the road. The wind had left its mark on him. So had the day. He swung one leg off the bike and stood still for just a second. There are moments when a person needs only a heartbeat to gather themselves before stepping back into the version of life they are trying to maintain. Jack had lived through enough disappointments to know how to put a composed face over private strain. He locked the motorcycle, straightened his shirt almost absent-mindedly, and turned toward the entrance, already preparing his professional expression. That was when he heard the laughter. Not friendly laughter. Not surprised laughter. The kind that breaks open too quickly, too loudly, too deliberately. He turned and saw them, two men from his middle school days, once close enough to know the shape of his early dreams, now standing there, dressed in the polished confidence of people who believed life had confirmed their superiority. Their faces lit up with recognition, but not warmth. Recognition, in some cases, is just a doorway for comparison. Jack's smile appeared automatically, then stiffened almost at once. For one brief second, memory moved through him with dangerous sweetness. School corridors, shared jokes, stolen afternoons. The kind of friendship built before pride had money to hide behind. But memory soured as quickly as it came, because the men in front of him were not meeting an old friend with affection. They were appraising him. One of them looked at the motorcycle and let out another laugh. The other followed without hesitation. Their words came in that half-joking tone people use when they want the cruelty to remain deniable. A CEO arriving on a motorcycle? What kind of poverty-struck executive was that supposed to be? The sound of their laughter bounced off the building facade and seemed to stay in the air longer than it should have. Jack stood still and let it happen. That was perhaps the most painful part, not that he was too weak to respond, but that he was too dignified to lower himself to their level. He knew exactly what they were seeing, not the years he had fought through, not the responsibilities he carried, not the private compromises he had made to keep everything from collapsing. They saw only the surface. A man once associated with success, stepping off a machine too modest for the image they preferred to assign him. And because humiliation is often most brutal when it confirms something a person already fears, the words sank deeper than he wanted to admit. Inside him, something tightened. He could feel the old contrast rising, the boy who once dreamed large, the man who now had to measure every expense, every impression, every fragile agreement. He had not stopped working, he had not stopped fighting, but in that moment, none of his invisible effort mattered. Appearance had won the room before he had even entered it. He gave the smallest possible nod and walked toward the building. He did not hurry. That would have looked like defeat, but each step felt heavier than the one before. Behind him, the laughter came again, followed by another sentence thrown carelessly at his back. What sort of CEO signs contracts and rides a motorcycle because he cannot even maintain the image of success? It was a ridiculous statement, shallow and vulgar, but it found its mark. By the time Jack entered the hallway, shame had already spread through him like cold rain. Not far away stood Phuc, his assistant, holding the documents for the meeting. The younger man had heard everything. His hands tightened around the papers so hard they bent slightly at the corners. He lowered his eyes, not out of indifference, but because helplessness often looks like silence when it has nowhere useful to go. He wanted to speak. That much was visible. But what could he say? That the mockery was unfair? That his boss deserved better? Some humiliations are made worse by witnesses trying and failing to rescue them. Jack sensed it at once. He did not want Phuc's pity. That, too, would wound him. So he forced a smile, not a convincing one. His face had already gone darker with the effort of containing himself, but it was enough to keep the day moving, enough to signal that they would continue, that work did not stop simply because self-respect had been bruised in a corridor. Yet even as he moved forward, he could feel the gap between who he had once imagined becoming and who the world believed it saw before him. That gap yawned open like an abyss. The meeting itself passed, but not in any way that mattered. Whatever contract had brought him there did not bring victory. By the time he returned to the sidewalk, the sky had shifted toward evening, and the failure of the day had settled fully into his body. He walked like a man, carrying more than papers and plans. Phuc remained close behind him, quiet, careful, unsure whether speaking would soothe anything or only expose the wound further. At the motorcycle, Jack paused. He turned to Phuc and, to the assistant's surprise, his voice was still warm. He told him not to worry. Everything would be fine. It was the sort of reassurance strong people offer out of habit, even when they themselves no longer believe it. The sentence flickered like a weak flame in deep wind. Phuc nodded, but sorrow stayed visible in his eyes. He had just watched the man he admired endure mockery and disappointment in the span of an hour, then immediately turn around and comfort someone else. The motorcycle started with a low, rough sound. It did not roar with status. It did not glitter. It simply carried them home. The wind on the road slapped against Jack's face with enough force to sting. He kept his eyes forward, but the laughter followed him anyway, lodged now in the back of his mind like something sharp and unfinished. The city moved around them in ordinary motion, people crossing streets, neon signs flickering on, market traffic beginning to thicken, and yet inside Jack there was only the echo of comparison. Once, he had believed that success would protect him from this sort of small cruelty. He knew better now. There is always someone ready to reduce a person's long journey to a single humiliating glance. And still, even then, he kept a bit of gentleness in reserve for the person behind him on the motorcycle. That realization came to him almost quietly. True strength had very little to do with contracts, polished image, or the car a man drove. True strength, perhaps, lived in this humbler place, in continuing to care for someone else while your own heart was still bleeding from what the world had just said about you. By the time he got home, fatigue had settled into him completely. The house was modest, but its modesty no longer embarrassed him the way public spaces sometimes did. At home, at least, the things that mattered were measured differently. He sat down on the sofa with the heaviness of a man who had been upright for too long. When Tu Tien asked what had happened, he told her in a voice flatter than usual, as if dullness might make the story hurt less. She listened without interrupting. At first, her face remained still. Then color rose into it. Her fists tightened. Anger flashed in her eyes so fiercely that for a moment it seemed she might march back out into the night and confront the two men herself. She said they had no right to treat him that way. No right to measure him by a motorcycle, by appearance, by one failed afternoon. Her outrage came quickly and sincerely, which made it more moving, not less. Because when someone is humiliated, there is a strange comfort in seeing another person refuse to accept the insult as normal. But anger can only go so far. After it passed, helplessness remained. Tu Tien knew she could not erase those words from Jack's memory. She could not go backward and place dignity back into the moment before it had been cut open. The room grew heavy with that knowledge. A dim yellow light stretched over the walls and softened nothing. Jack fell silent and stared toward the window as if the dark outside might offer him something the room could not. Then Tu Tien stood up and moved behind him. She did not lecture him about his worth. She did not insist too hard on optimism. She simply wrapped both arms around him from behind and rested herself there, letting her warmth settle over his shoulders like water over scorched ground. It was such a simple gesture, and yet it held more intelligence than many speeches. She understood that wounded pride does not always need correction first. Sometimes it needs shelter. Jack exhaled slowly. He had not realized until that moment how much he needed someone to be angry on his behalf. Someone to refuse the logic of humiliation without asking him to perform recovery too quickly. Her embrace did not solve the problem. It did something more human. It made him less alone inside it. After a while, she took his hand and gently pulled him to his feet. Her voice softened. "Come to the market," she told him. "Let them buy some meat. Let them cook something good." It was not an escape in the grand sense. It was almost absurdly ordinary. Yet perhaps that was exactly why it worked. Some days cannot be healed by dramatic declarations. They can only be crossed through with the help of familiar errands, warm food, and the presence of someone who refuses to let humiliation become the final mood of the night. The evening market was alive in all the ways pain sometimes hates and needs at once. Vendors called out prices. Knives hit chopping boards in quick rhythm. Plastic bags rustled. Neon light reflected in puddles left by the day's rain. The smell of herbs, raw meat, charcoal smoke, and fresh vegetables drifted through the aisles in layers. Tu Tien moved carefully among the stalls, choosing cuts of meat with the concentration of someone trying to rebuild steadiness through action. Jack followed beside her, holding the bag, his sadness still present but no longer total. She spoke here and there, lightly, not forcing cheerfulness, only making enough room for it to appear if it could. He looked at her more than once in that crowded place and felt something inside him begin to loosen. Not because the contract no longer mattered, not because the mockery had disappeared, but because companionship, when it is honest, has a way of breaking the isolation that shame depends on. Each step through the market felt like crossing a narrow bridge between failure and something smaller, more durable than victory hope. Back in the kitchen, the world grew quieter. The room was small and familiar, almost humble in its closeness. Knife against cutting board, the low hiss of heat, the rising scent of food. Tu Tien worked beside him, and the rhythm of their shared preparation seemed to gather the broken pieces of the day and place them somewhere manageable. When she finally spoke, her voice carried neither performance nor pity. She simply said that maybe there had been no good news that day, but the best thing was that they still had each other. Jack stopped moving for a moment. The sentence entered him with the gentle force of truth he had been too wounded to articulate himself. It did not deny his disappointment. It did not glorify suffering. It merely placed one fact beside another. Yes, the day had hurt him, but no, it had not taken everything. He looked at her then with something close to wonder. How strange that love, at its deepest, often arrives not as rescue from hardship, but as presence within it. Not as dazzling triumph, but as a hand brushing yours beside a stove, while smoke rises and grief finally begins to soften at the edges. They spoke a little after that of old memories, of hopes not yet entirely buried, of how life kept asking strange things from people who were only trying to hold on. The fire beneath the pan cast warm light upward over their faces, and for a brief stretch of time, the kitchen became more than a room. It became a place where failure lost its right to define the whole day. When the meal was ready, they sat down across from each other. The food was simple, the room was quiet, chopsticks touched plates softly. Outside the window, night had settled fully, and the world beyond the house seemed far away. The sadness had not vanished. It remained in the pauses between them, in the way Jack's smile still carried ache, in the way Tu Tien chose not to crowd him with too many words. But grief shared respectfully can become strangely tender. At one point, she reached across and held his hand. That was enough. The meal went on slowly, almost solemnly, as if both of them understood that they were not simply eating dinner. They were enduring the aftershocks of a day that had attacked Jack's dignity in a way more public disasters never could. Every bite carried the weight of unspoken thoughts, yet nothing about the silence felt empty. It was the silence of two people holding on to each other while the storm outside their walls continued to move. By the end, the food remained unfinished, not because it lacked flavor, but because emotion had filled them more heavily than hunger had. Jack looked at Tu Tien and felt gratitude, so deep it nearly frightened him. How easy it is to worship success when it is present. How much harder and more meaningful it is to recognize love when success has stepped aside and left only the person who stays. And perhaps that was the truth the day had been pushing him toward all along. Life was not fair. It never had been. Contracts failed. Old friends became mirrors of contempt. Public image cracked. Pride suffered. But sincere love, love that got angry for you, walked through the market beside you, cooked with you, sat through your silence, and let you hurt without withdrawing, was rarer than any glamorous sign of achievement. In the end, the mockery still existed. The failed contract still existed. The old motorcycle still waited outside, unchanged. But so did something else. A woman who chose to stand beside him not because he looked successful, but because he was his most wounded self and still worth loving. A small kitchen where despair was not chased out dramatically, only patiently warmed through. A meal half-eaten because feelings were too large, yet meaningful precisely because it had been shared. And so the day closed not with triumph, but with understanding. Jack did not suddenly become invulnerable. He did not wake the next morning free from shame, but he saw more clearly than before that a person's value cannot be measured by the vehicle outside a building or the laughter of those who have forgotten how to be kind. Sometimes, the only real answer to humiliation is not revenge or explanation. It is going home, sitting across from someone who sees your wound without turning away, and discovering that although life may strip you of glamour, it cannot touch the love that waits for you at the table. That is the emotional truth this story leaves behind. Success may impress the world, but sincere love is what saves a heart when the world has finished laughing.